Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of No One's a Critic. I'm Kino, joined as always by Mac. How you doing this week, sir?
Doing well. I'm a little bit under the weather, not feeling very good, but trudging along. Still finishing up the True Detective season 2 video. Editing has commenced. That's fun. Revisiting that's like a blast from the. I'm rewatching it. I'm like, oh yeah, shit. This like I forgot about. It was like so hyped. It was like one of the most hyped, like the most anticipated thing, and then it just fucking died. What about you? What are you're working on your Wire videos? And unfortunately, we got some sad news today.
I know. So this episode is dedicated to the memory of the one and only Cedric Daniels. Lance Reddick fortunately passed away today, the day we're recording this. Very sad because he was great in a bunch of stuff, not just The Wire. You know, Oz. I loved him on that show. I know he was on some other shows I hadn't seen, like Resident Evil, Bosch, some other ones as well. But I know that everything he did, people tended to really love his performance. And I think he's just one of the most incredible actors on The Wire. Like his performance of Cedric Daniels is insanely memorable. He's just an insanely great actor. And yeah, tribute to him, man. He was a legend.
Um, so glad you put it because I I really think that we and I guess I don't really think he qualifies because I think he's like well known enough, but I really think that we don't give enough credit to that guy in movies. Um, because everyone, I mean, obviously, like everyone focuses on like the stars and like the main players and whatnot, but it's really it it really is amazing how much like the bit parts, the smaller parts in a given movie, just how much they enhance it and how much they sort of carry it just as much as the leads. Um, and yeah, he was someone who obviously he's in The Wire, Lieutenant Daniels, big role, but yeah, every time he would pop up in something, it would just make it would just be better. And v- there are a select group of actors that are like that, where you're like, hey, he's in it, and it just makes the movie better. And no matter how small the role, you just bring it. You're all you land it, and he definitely was one of those actors.
Well, I think that's what's so cool about The Wire too, and it's funny. Like today, the video I was working on was about McNulty, and obviously Daniels plays a big part of McNulty's story. But what I talked about in that section is the fact that The Wire really doesn't have any like stars or even like a main character. All the characters are kind of bit characters. They're side characters to the larger story, which is about the main character is Baltimore. And I think that's what's so magical about the show is that like they all have that same quality that Lance had, which is every scene that they're in, it feels like, oh my god, this person is perfect. You know, the actor who plays Bodhi is like that. The actor who plays Lester Freeman is like that. Obviously, Michael K. Williams as Omar. That's he's grown even beyond that. But all these people just feel so perfect for the role, but they're not stars. They're not like, oh yeah, I came here for this person. It just feels natural to the story and natural to the world. And I think that's what sets The Wire apart from a lot of shows, which are typically carried by, a few of the actors who are stars, or they're just really carrying the rest of the cast forward. Everyone on The Wire really pulled their weight when it came to acting.
Yeah, the only other show I can really think of that feels like that to me is Game of Thrones. Where it's a show where like at some point you kind of realize like, oh, there really isn't like a main character. I guess, or funny enough, in The Wire, that's sort of why. Um, how ironic that I mean, arguably you could make the case that like for season one, McNulty is posited as like our main character, but obviously that changes as the series goes on. But how funny that the best season of the show, but as noted by most fans, is the one where McNulty is, and it's not good because of that, but in spite of it, the fact that McNulty is scaled back so much as a character in season four.
Yeah, well, I talked about that in one of my videos. That again, I think it reinforces the idea that this is not McNulty's story. He is the character driving forward a lot of the plot. He gets the investigation going, but it's about every one of the characters. It's all of their stories. It's a story about the city and the people who live in it and the community. And that's why, like, The Wire really transcends almost the genre of, like, a drama, which is typically about characters. It is about characters, but not any one single character. It's about how they all function in relation to each other. um, but we could go on and on about The Wire. We love talking about it so much. But this episode we wanted to talk about another show that came out, and that has a lot of discussion going on about it. The Last of Us, which you have a deep history with, and I do not. So, as noted, if you guys follow both of us, you'll know that Mac has talked a lot about the Last of Us. He's a big fan of the video game that it's based on. I've not played the game at all. I've followed some general discussion, so I know about the game. I know I've seen videos about it, but I'm not like a fan, like a deep fan of it. So I'm coming in with a very fresh perspective. So I think this will be an interesting discussion to kind of see how those two viewpoints kind of view the show. Do you want to get us started with, like, maybe talk about your experience before, like, with the games first?
Yeah, let me open that up because I kind of want to start with you in terms of your thoughts on it, so we can kind of, because I don't want to kind of give, I don't want to like give my, I don't want to coat the impression with all my stuff. Um, so yeah, and what may have been one of the greatest weekends of my life was it was a summer, it was a week, I don't know if it was summer actually, it was a weekend of 2013, um, and I was blazed. I was just blazed as a guy. My roommate was out of town. And I played. It was over the course of a single weekend. I played The Last of Us and BioShock Infinite back to back, back to back, and over the course of a weekend. It was while stoned. It was a lot, especially BioShock Infinite. That was the ending was whoa. It's like
Those are
midnight.
some
I was
great
like, oh
games to
fuck.
be stoned to, I imagine.
Mm. Especially midnight stone BioShock Infinite
Yeah.
ending. I'm like, whoa, bro. um, And yeah, in The Last of Us, the story is the ending, especially. It's one that kind of it doesn't like hit you. It doesn't. It's not like this
Hmm.
big like whoa ending. It's very
Yeah.
subtle. It's almost kind of like you're almost kind of like what?
Hmm.
But once you let it sink in,
Yeah.
once you let the implications of the ending sit in,
Yeah.
um, that's sort of what I always view as such as like as a good ending. One where you're kind of
Hmm.
like at the start. Because like
Yeah.
the worst is when you're like, "Whoa, that was awesome," and then like the next day you're kind of like, "Oh,
Yeah.
actually, that was kind of lame." But the
Yeah.
opposite, where you're like, "Oh, I didn't really get that," but then like a week later, it's like you finally get it. You're like, "Oh shit, that was brilliant."
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I've just been a huge fan ever since.
Yeah.
Um, Last of Us Part Two was not a fan of, as I
Yeah.
have I made a small video on my channel
Hmm.
about it. And yeah, I was pretty. uh, I mean, a lot of people were really hesitant about the series, given that
Yeah.
Druckmann. I mean, we could. I don't know if you want to. We can go into the whole history as to why, Last of Us with Bruce Straley and all that stuff. It's kind of it's a lot, but
Hmm.
suffice to say that Druckmann is not viewed in a good light by many
Yeah.
Last of Us
Yeah.
fans. Um,
Well, I mean, this show, I mean, I've been following the discourse a little bit, just here and there. Obviously, I'm not deep into the community, but it seemed like it was the usual kind of bullshit about, wokeism in the show and stuff like that. But it seemed as episodes went on, more and more people were like, okay, this is good. I saw criticisms and stuff, of course, but it seemed like the general consensus was it got better the longer it went on. I don't know if that's been your experience. Is that how your community has kind of reacted?
Absolutely. Well, I think it was more about as the show was going on. I well, there were a couple things. One, I think it was one, I actually think that's how the game is. The
Yeah,
game actually isn't anything special um up until like probably. Oh yeah, I guess spoilers. I'll put it in the description, but just in general.
people
Um,
know we
I
give spoilers.
Yeah, of course. I would argue the game doesn't really start until after Tess's death. I mean, obviously the game is starting, but like
Yeah.
Tess's death is sort of like
Yeah.
not necessarily the inciting incident, but like the first act turn, like where the
Yeah.
journey truly begins, where we finally see Joel and Ellie begin their relationship for
Mhm.
good. Um, and yeah, so with that in mind, I think, and one of the main complaints I had of the show was, as much as I loved episode 3, the story of Bill and Frank, I did think that we lost some time developing Joel and Ellie's relationship.
Mm.
I would have rather had a episode of just them,
Yeah.
like just developing their relationship, and
Yeah.
then have that episode. I understand why they did it like this in terms of pacing. Like there's not the
Mhm.
gameplay segments that you can fill in.
Yeah.
And of course they changed Bill's story, which we can talk about that, cuz that's like kind of where like the whole woke thing comes in. But but yeah, I think once it got to episode 4 and episode 5 and we saw them start to like build their
Mhm.
relationship, and again, that's kind of how the game is, where it kind of sneaks up on you. You're kind of like,
Yeah.
you're almost kind of like in Joel's headspace, where you're like, oh, who is
Yeah.
this fucking kid? But then
Yeah.
you fall in love with Ellie just like Joel does, and that's
Mhm.
why it works so well as an experience.
Yeah. I should give my perspective here, since again I know a little bit about the game, but I'm coming in with a completely fresh perspective. So I don't know like what they were trying to do with certain scenes or how they were trying to pace it out. I was just following it as a show as each episode came out. And I felt like this I don't this is gonna sound bad to people who like this show, but I was kind of bored during a lot of it. And maybe that is meant to mirror how the game is at certain points, because I've seen some gameplay segments where it's a lot of walking, a lot of interacting with stuff. And I felt like they were trying to translate some of that into the show. Long sequences of them walking, talking, not being attacked. And I think those kind of sequences are funner in games versus when I was watching the show, I was like, where are the fucking zombies, the fungus zombies, where are the attackers like coming? And again, I love shows like The Wire, right? So it's not that a slow show bores me, but one of the things that was hard for me to be kind of grounded in what was going on was it felt like every single episode introduced a character. I kind of was like, okay, I'm starting to get to understand you, and then they die and then they move on. Which again, I imagine probably mirrors like gameplay segments where it's like you're going to an area, you meet someone, something happens, then you move on to another one.
Yeah, well, it's the structure of like a road movie, like that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, sorta, yeah. But I'm like, again, if we're gonna take episodes dedicated to each of these characters, who I will say made them kind of interesting in the episodes they appear in, but then they just die. I was like, well, I'm kind of not. I'm not grounded in what's going on here. Now, of course, the element that carries through all of it is Joel and Ellie's relationship, and I appreciated that. But I felt like a lot of the character stuff they were doing with the other characters didn't necessarily contribute to Joel and Ellie, like you brought up with Bill and Frank. It's like, okay, cool, we got their story, and that's kind of interesting, but it doesn't really inform Joel and Ellie. So, why am I caring about it that much?
Well, I think that's, well, there's two things to say. One, I do think that that was a flaw of the show, where one thing to note in the game is that we are completely in Joel's perspective for literally the entire game. The opening section of the game, which only lasts about, I want to say, 15 minutes, we actually control Sarah, so we're in her POV. But then after Sarah dies, we stick with Joel. So all the character interactions we go through. So even when we meet Bill, and even when we meet Henry and Sam, and even when we meet Tommy and Jackson, it's all through Joel's POV perspective. Everything is through his perspective. So even when we're spending time developing other characters, we're still sort of like with him. Whereas in the show, I do agree where there were a lot of scenes where it was like, for example, at the beginning of episode 5, um, the previous episode is when Joel and Ellie wake up and Henry and Sam are, they have the guns to their head. And then episodes 5 spends about 15 minutes giving us the backstory of Henry and Sam. And it's kind of like that, like all of that wasn't in the game, of course, because we're Joel's POV. So Henry just tells about where they were. Now I understand from a narrative perspective why they did that in the show. However, all that time is now being taken away from developing Joel and Ellie. Um, the second part is I feel like it is communicated better in the game how each segment, particularly the Bill and Henry and Sam segments, it's they do contribute to Joel's arc. So in the game, oh, so you don't, oh yeah, because you haven't played. Okay, so and this was one of the big criticisms right out of the gate was that in the game when Joel and Ellie meet Bill for the first time, Bill is he's still in like his we kind of saw at the beginning of the episode. He's in his like doomsday prepper mode. He's like super paranoid. The town is rigged with traps, and he mentions Frank. He's like, "Oh yeah, my partner Frank," and but we never see Frank. We don't know where he is. But then at the very end of the segment, um, we come across Frank's body. He hung himself because he got infected. And so so the way it's framed in the game is that Bill's sort of um what's the word? His like sort of pessimistic attitude of the world drove Frank away, and now so at the end Bill is all alone and Joel just leaves him. Bill doesn't die at all in the game, and what that's supposed to represent is that Joel sort of sees in Bill someone he doesn't want to be. Joel kind of feels like if I don't open up if I don't try to care about someone again, I'm gonna end up like this fucking psycho. Whereas in the show, I do think they did a pretty decent job of how it was Bill learning to like love someone again and trust them. That inspires Joel to kind of open up and okay, now I'll. I think it works better in the game. I do appreciate how it works in the show. Um, However, that's another issue where that's an entire in the game. It's Bill, Joel, and Ellie and Bill have a lot of like funny banter. So even when we're with Bill, there's still characterization being built between Joel and Ellie. Whereas in the show, that entire hour, it was excellent. I loved it, but it did not contribute to Joel and Ellie's
that that's been my
relationship.
biggest issue getting into it, like I said, is that like it felt like none of the character stuff that's being developed carries forward, besides like, yeah, I mean, I think Joel does learn something with the letter that Bill gives him at the end, which is like, hey, our mission in life is to protect the people we love. And he carries that forward to an extent, but like I said, I would have liked it. And again, I understand that they're trying to keep it as close to the gameplay formula as they can, but I would have liked it if, let's say, the Sam and whatever is, I can't remember all the characters' names, but the two brothers, right? The younger
Sam and
brother gets
Henry.
infected. Sam and Henry. I would have liked it. It's like, hey, maybe take that backstory segment, put it in an earlier episode. Like maybe we get a part of it then, and then we'll, each episode we'll see a little bit of them, and then it can kind of feel like the story's carrying forward.
Or just cut it. Like I just hey, it's like, hey, what's going? Like Joel's like, hey, what are you doing? And then he says, hey, we're doing this. We're on the run. We don't need it. Again, I understood it's supposed to be like cinematic, but it's like we don't need it. Come on.
Well, I would have liked to follow some of these characters beyond, if we're gonna see their POV. I would have liked to have followed them for longer than just one episode, even if they're supposed to die in that section. Another thing I would have really liked is if they had spaced out the Sarah stuff. Let's start the episode or the series in the apocalypse, and then flash back to like what made Joel the way he is. And again, it sounds like from what you're describing that like the way they did it mirrors the way the game plays. But from like an immersion standpoint, I would have liked to have like been in the world with the zombies from the beginning, and then just kind of shown over time, been like, oh, okay, this is why Joel is the way he is. I felt like that would have been a more natural storytelling style. But again, I understand why they did it the way they did it.
Well, the thing to note too is the game. And this is another issue that and this is more I think of a personal preference. I did think the way they built up Sarah's we're in her POV and we're following her around town. It's like she starts seeing like things are weird, like what's going on. Um, in the game, we do play as Sarah, but I'm not underestimating when I say it's like 10, 12 minutes. We see the scene. So the majority of all the Sarah stuff is cut. We see the scene where she gives Joel the birthday present, the watch. He puts her to bed. She wakes up. She goes downstairs. Joel is there like something's wrong. They drive away. There's the whole segment in the city where it gets panic. They run. The soldier comes. So yeah, it it does kind of have like, so it doesn't start with the apocalypse, but it's like you almost don't even realize it because it's such a quick portion of the game. It's like a cold open in a sense. It feels like that. So that's why it doesn't really feel as whereas in the game I did kind of think, I was like, come on, like
Yeah,
okay, like I
let's
and
get to
I
the zombie fighting. Yeah.
and well, I understand that maybe coming from someone who has played the game, that's sort of like and I know that Sarah dies, obviously. Maybe that's a bias of mine, so it doesn't really act or work the same way as it does for me as it should someone else. Um, but yeah, the game was just so efficient in that manner, and that's what I appreciated. The storytelling was just incredibly efficient. Like, get in, get out. Here's what you need. Let's go. So yeah, that was one of the. But that might just be a personal preference for me when it comes to this game.
And like I said, there were a lot of sequences where I was like, I can imagine how this would play because I play games like The Last of Us. It's like a lot of walking, a lot of interacting with stuff. Like I felt like the scene with Ellie and her friend in the fire in FEDRA or whatever, uh, where they're in the mall and they're playing the games. I imagine that works as like a gameplay segment because you're like, oh, okay, I'm interacting with the games. I'm walking around the mall. That's cool. From a watching perspective, I was like, okay, this is kind of stretching on for a while. There's no zombies attacking right now. There's nothing going on. I get we're setting up a friendship here that's going to end in tragedy because, again, every character who's been introduced in this series has died in the episode that they got introduced in. Um, but again, I think some of those things work better in a video game format where even if nothing's happening, you're kind of having fun controlling the character and walking around and stuff. Versus some of those segments felt pretty drawn out from a viewership perspective.
Yeah, so two things. So that was that segment. If the episode is actually called Left Behind, so that is actually the title of the DLC of the video game. So in the show, after Joel is stabbed, and then he, um, so in the game, this is actually one of like the coolest parts of the game, and this is why POV is so important. For like 7 hours of like the 10-hour game, we're playing as Joel, we're in his POV. And then we get that scene where he in the game he actually falls off of a balcony and lands on a rebar. And it actually, that was one thing that kind of bugged me in the show, where he has the bat in his stomach and then he pulls it out, and it's like, bro, that's like the one thing you
I
don't
know
do.
what you're not supposed to do. Yeah.
Whereas in the game, it's like it's on the floor, so like
Yeah.
he has to pull himself.
Yeah.
Although
Yeah.
in the game, it's like absurd. They actually, I think they changed it in the remake. In the game, he loses like a huge amount of blood, like unreal,
Oh
and
yeah.
it's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
it's
He
just a
would
little
die.
thing, but
Yeah.
it's kind of like, but in the game, what happens is that Joel falls off, and Ellie's like, Joel, and then it smash cuts,
Yeah.
and then it cuts to Ellie in the winter hunting the deer,
Yeah.
but all of a sudden we're controlling Ellie.
Yeah.
And so in the game you're like, "Oh fuck, like what is
Yeah. Is he
and
dead? Yeah.
is he dead?" And it also plays with POV in terms of, and we'll get to that when we discuss the ending, but about sort of Ellie feeling, we're kind of getting the sense that Joel is sort of redundant in Ellie's journey. Like Joel isn't the main character of the story, Ellie is.
Yeah.
And we can discuss that when we get to the ending. But
Mhm.
so yeah, so the DLC, which was not, so obviously it was not part of the act, like the original game.
Mhm.
Um, it's framed as after Ellie drags Joel, she patches him up and drags him away from the college.
Mhm.
They hide in a mall, and as Ellie is going through the mall hunting for supplies, there are some raiders who come in, and so she's fighting through the raiders, and it cuts back and forth between that and her in the mall with Riley. And
Yeah.
so the point of the entire DLC is to show like we'll have a scene with her and Riley, and they'll be like, what's the game? What's the squirt gun game? Whatever it's called at the carnival,
Yeah, yeah, I
where
know
you
what you're talking
squirt the
about.
gun.
Yeah,
So we'll have that scene, but then the next scene will have Ellie in a firefight with the.
yeah.
So it's sort of doing this sort of, not only is it building up the Ellie and Riley relationship, but I think it was supposed to mean like a sort of like a loss of innocence. It's supposed to
I get what you're saying.
look
Yeah.
how far she's come, that sort of thing.
And that sounds
Um,
way more interesting than the segment we got on the show. You know, it just
yeah,
felt like nothing was. And I get it's like character stuff with her and Riley, but again, that sounds more interesting than like visually and like from like an action pacing perspective than the
I think
sequence we got.
I think most people agreed that, and this is, I don't really understand why they didn't do this, because it's a streaming service, so they can do whatever they want. If that episode was like 30 minutes, it would have been infinitely better. It didn't have to be an hour. I don't know why. I think the DLC only takes like an hour and a half to complete. So the fact that the whole episode was an hour, it's like, okay, it's like you made, and that goes back to like the efficiency of storytelling. We get it now. Okay, let's go. Let's move on.
And another thing, I was bothered by the fact that it was only 9 episodes. Now again, I don't want the story to be bloated, and maybe you'll tell me that like, hey, no, 9 episodes covers everything we need to cover. But I was like, I've noticed that shows have been getting more and more comfortable having shorter and shorter seasons. Which I'm like, okay, sure, don't bloat the story out, but like also, you know, give me a full fucking season if you're gonna give me 10 episodes here. Like I think what's it called? Stranger Things. Like what is it? Like 7, 8 episodes total. No, I can't wait for that show to end. But you know, I was like, give me a full
well,
fucking
that
season if
doesn't
you're gonna give me something.
well that doesn't really count, because like the last season was like each episode was like an hour and a half, and the last episode was like 2.5 hours, and I'm like, why is that even an episode? Like, why why not just make it? I guess they just they want it, like, you don't want to like break up the action, but I'm like, most people are like binging this shit anyway, but whatever. Um, I mean, I didn't have a problem with that. In terms of like, it did pretty much cover everything in the game. If they actually cut out the Left Behind episode, which is the DLC in the game, it would have been about 8 episodes, which is about 8 hours, and the game takes about 10 hours, 10 to 12 hours to complete. So it's right along there. But obviously, we are missing out on a lot of those, just sort of those little walking sections with Ellie, which really do, um, especially in the gameplay. It really does. It almost does it in a very subtle way. Like, you don't really notice it. You're kind of like, at first you're kind of like, oh, this fucking brat, but then you kind of are like, oh, there's Ellie. Like, it's just sort of, it takes it takes advantage of the medium very well.
Well, it's immersion. You know, I mean, that's what a lot of these games are all about. Is like making you feel like you're the character and you're in their world and you're interacting with all this stuff. And like I said, I enjoy a lot of games like that. I'm curious since I mean you seem to be kind of ingrained into the community. What has the response been from people who are fans of the games? Have they generally liked it, and or do they hate it?
I think most people agreed it was a pretty good adaptation. Again, at the start, people were a little bit. There were little changes that were made that we were kind of like, that seems a little bit weird. Why are you doing that? That's kind of, what are you doing? What are you gonna? How are you gonna develop this? Um, but as things went on, I felt like I started to trust the writers more. It's like, oh, okay, they made this change, but I understand why they did this. Uh, this makes sense. Oh, okay, that's cool how they did that. One big change, which I thought was kind of cool, was in the final episodes, Joel's story of his failed suicide attempt. That was actually not in the game at all. That was never even mentioned. Um, which I liked it, but at the same time, it's like, I don't really know if it fits. Like, it's with Joel at the beginning, or I guess it does kind of fit. Like, Joel's entire character in the game is supposed to be, here's this man who has lost everything, and now his entire desire is to just survive, like the most basic human instinct. But the question the game deposits is what is surviving worth if you don't have anyone to fight for? And that's what he eventually learned. But no, I think most people agreed. I really feel like a lot of the fandom warmed up to Pedro and Bella. At first, we were kind of like, I don't know. And the first couple episodes were like, I don't know, are they trying too hard? But by the last couple episodes, we're like, oh, okay, they're Joel and Ellie,
Yeah,
absolutely.
I didn't understand and maybe because again I'm not familiar with the game. I didn't understand the controversy around the casting because I liked both of those actors. You know, I thought they've done good jobs with the stuff I've seen them in. Pedro especially, he's been in a lot of great stuff. So I wasn't sure why people were upset about his casting.
It's sort of like, well, I mean, obviously there's like the racial aspect of it, but that was only a few people. Um, that was like it was only like the usual suspects, you know. Um, One thing I will say is I do think Pedro, and I don't really mind this in the show. Although I do think it hurts the thematic weight of it a little bit. Because Pedro is known as in the media, sort of everyone loves Pedro. He's very, um, kind of like a warm presence, stuff like that. Whereas Joel in the game, and Joel does is like, you know, he's beloved by the fandom. However, something about Joel in the games is he always has this like, he's not like a nice guy. He's not like a good guy. He's this kind of like, he's always sort of like this guy who you're afraid could possibly like who will and can and has fucking kill you if he needs to. And there was something about the way he was presented. Funny enough, this is a little thing. I actually, if you look at the remake, I actually think they ruined Joel's design a little bit because in the original game there was something on Joel's face. I don't know what it was. It was like a sort of like harshness. It was very, he wasn't like this soft fatherly guy. He was like this, you know, and especially at the beginning of the game after Sarah's death. No, he's like on survivor bastard killer mode. And it's only towards the end of the game where he regains that warm fatherly vibe. Um and so I think that was why some people were like, were Pedro, they were a bit, yeah.
I could see that because you're right. Pedro, maybe it's the way he acts, and maybe it's just what I've seen him in. But he's very likable, and I've never at once at this watching it thought like, oh, you're a monster. Even at the end, and maybe we should talk about the ending here. I've seen people discussing the ending and like arguing back and forth about whether Joel did the right thing or not. And maybe it's just me, but I'm like, I've seen so many fucking stories that have done this where it's like it's not even controversial for me. This whole like, do we sacrifice one to save the many kind of thing? I'm like, no, of course not. He saves the girl, right? I've been through enough stories that try to justify this where it was like it wasn't shocking at all for me. It was kind of like a little bit passe. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think that was it was a miscommunication between the game and the move in the TV show. So one thing, and this is like one of the most, I might get some people pissed off for saying this, because it's never actually. So I'll preface it by saying this. One thing that pisses me off about the Last of Us fandom is, um, for lack of a better word, people, they kind of suck Joel's cock a bit too much in the sense of like they, and I see this a lot with like, um especially like younger, I don't want to like stereotype, but like especially like younger dudes, they kind of get a bit too, they don't really see the situation objectively. They kind of like, they almost let their emotions of for a character of a situation almost blind them, so they almost make kind of like silly arguments. um One thing that is, and one of the big arguments is, did Joel do the right thing? Was he a good man for doing it? So, and you can give your opinion, but here's my opinion. Joel had moral justification to do what he did, like because the Fireflies were, if in the, well, actually in the show, I actually think they make it worse because Marlene says to Joel, "Hey, we spoke to Ellie and I just told her we were gonna do some tests, but actually we're gonna kill her and like cut her open. In the game, Joel and Ellie fall into some water, and Ellie is knocked unconscious, and that's when the guards find them and they knock out Joel. And then so in the game, Ellie she never actually sees Marlene. She just is unconscious. She goes to the hospital. Joel saves her. So because no one actually asked Ellie like, "Hey, do you want to do this? Is this something that you want to do?" Um, Joel, I would argue, does have the moral justification to save her. However, and this is like what I get. I try to like, and this is like what I think a lot of fans don't kind of absorb. When we're talking about whether a character is a good person, we don't just look at whether or not their actions are morally justified. We have to ask what are their motivations? What are the reasons for doing what they're doing? Something that is communicated very well in the game, not so much in the show, is that while in the game, Ellie never says, if yes, I would die in order to make a cure. In the game, I would argue it is very, 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 very clear that Ellie absolutely would have. It's like one of the big things in the game is she has extreme survivor's guilt. That all of her friends are she has to kill her friends. She has to see them die. So Ellie's characterization is about I will do whatever it takes to do this. And in the game, they actually note that Joel sort of knows that, or at least he suspects it. And so he knows that when he's saving Ellie, he's not doing it because, oh no, he's not doing it because, oh no, they're violating her consent and her civil liberties. No, he's doing it because he's a traumatized father who doesn't want to lose his daughter. And he knows, um, in the back of his mind that this is what Ellie probably would have wanted, and I'm robbing her of that, which is why this is what I try to I want to strangle some fans. This is the whole reason why he lies to her. Like if he really didn't think he did something wrong in this situation, then why did he lie about it? Um, because he knows at the end when he lies to her that they are now going to have a strained relationship. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I felt like a lot of that was communicated through the show too. I felt like Ellie would have sacrificed herself for the cure. Um, I was like, it didn't shock me like that Joel did what he did. Like it wasn't even up for discussion. It was like, of course he's gonna save her, because again, he cares about her. He again, there's a father daughter relationship there. I also was like, I mean, the Fireflies didn't even know if they could make a cure from her. They were going to kill her, and like on the off chance that, hey, yeah, maybe there is a cure, but we don't know if that's going to survive, if that's going to make a cure, if it's going to be worthwhile or not. So it didn't shock me as controversial at all. And the fact that he killed those people to save her was like, no, they were going to kill him. They were going to get in his way. He didn't shoot people who like when he shot the doctor who was when he told him like get her off, and he was like no, and he shot him to get rid of him. But when the nurses were like, okay, here you go, he was like, okay, I'll let you live. Um, and him killing Marlene at the end again, this might be a symptom of like the fact that we only met Marlene for one episode, so I just didn't care whether she lived or died. And she also, to me, was not presented as like a complicated. Like I think the show was trying to make it be like a complicated issue where it's like Marlene is a good person. She's trying to save the world or whatever, and she'll even do these things. And maybe there's some justification to what she does, but it's just we didn't spend enough time with her for me to give a shit about her motives. I was like, yeah, sure, kill her. It doesn't bother me in the slightest. You know?
Well, yeah, so that was another flaw which I don't really understand why they did this in the show. It actually makes no sense to me. So in the game, um it's similar to in the show where Marlene was friends with Anna, Ellie's mother. That's another thing too. It doesn't really make that big of a difference, but I suppose that it seems to be implied in the uh show that the reason that Ellie is immune is that because Anna, her mother, was bitten just right before she gave birth. Um, that is not in the game at all. We never actually learn why Ellie is immune. Which kind of does bug me because it's like it's just funny how Anna lies to her about it, which is kind of frustrating because it's like if you didn't lie to her, then you guys could easily replicate this, right? Like we'll just get a bunch of bitches pregnant, bite them, and then have a bunch of immune babies. So I think that was kind of a weird. I don't know why they added that. I don't think it was necessary, but in the show, it showed that Anna and Marlene. Of course, Marlene takes Ellie, and then she shoots Anna. But then in the show, for some reason, it's implied that Marlene puts Ellie in some sort of like in she doesn't talk to her until like 15 years later. That's why when Ellie's tied up, she's like, "Who the fuck are you, Marlene?" And then she's
Yeah,
like, "I
she
know your
said
mother."
she put her in the FEDRA camp because they would keep her safe, the school or whatever where they were training
Yeah,
her.
and in the game, she does go to the Fedra camp, but it's implied that Marlene keeps has had a relationship with Ellie throughout her life. So already because at the beginning, um, yeah, that's one thing that was weird at the beginning when I was kind of like, what's going on when Ellie was tied up. I'm like, why is she tied up? She knows Marlene, like she's very close to Marlene. So I think that's part of the reason why at the end of the game, Marlene dying is supposed to be a bit more shocking, is because Ellie loves Marlene. She's my mom's friend. She's someone I know and trust. Whereas in the show, yeah, it didn't really land as well because Marlene isn't as much of a familiar character in that sense.
I I also was like, and again, I don't know how much of this comes from the game or not, but the whole Fedra Firefly conflict, I felt like was not developed in the show. I get the whole premise of like a tyrannical government that's trying to keep order versus freedom fighters who are willing to sacrifice some safety for their civil liberties and their freedoms. I felt like, I mean, that's a quintessential conflict in a lot of media, right? I didn't kind of get like that conflict didn't feel like developed at all for me. It just kind of felt like something that happened in the background. Like sometimes Fedra is good, sometimes they're like fascist rapist people, sometimes the Fireflies are terrorists, sometimes they're developing a science weapon. I couldn't ground myself in like what are the strengths of each side? What are they all about? I don't know if that's an important part of the game or not. But the school system especially felt like it's like, wait, are these like fascist Nazi terrorists that also allow little girls to like train and they get to escape at night? Like it's like it felt like a boarding school, and I was like, wait, what's going on here?
Yeah, so that's actually sort of a or I don't want to say controversial, but it's sort of a debated argument in the game where at the beginning, obviously, we're set up as like, oh, Fedra. I mean, obviously, Fedra is kind of fucked up. They do some fucked up
Yeah.
shit, like they're totalitarian. However, and then at the beginning, the Fireflies are like, oh, this rebel group. But
Mm-hmm.
as the game goes on, two things start to kind of be developed. One, we kind of don't really the line whether or not like the Fireflies are the good guys kind of gets blurred, and I think this is purposeful. They're not really saying the Fireflies are good people. They're not like, oh, they're good. They're the good guys against the bad
Mm-hmm.
military. It's sort of like are they like the good people, or are they just are they just the enemy of Fedra? Is Fedra
Yeah.
bad? Well, yeah, they do bad stuff, but like, are they like terrible, evil? Ha ha ha! Like, it's not like fucking like it's not like the Star Wars rebels and the Empire, right? It's not like,
Yeah.
oh, there's clearly one side who is seen as like the good guy.
Mm-hmm.
And two, and this is another big thing, and I would almost argue it is a bit of a contrivance in the ending. Um, and this might be a nitpick, but I have to bring it up in a second. Um, it does seem, and I guess you can get this from the show. It does seem like throughout the show and the game, the narrative kind of makes the Fireflies seem somewhat incompetent, where it's like, hey, where are the guys at the state house? Oh fuck, they got killed.
Yeah.
Let's go to the college. Oh shit, they're dead too. And it kind of like almost makes them seem like they're not very sophisticated. They're a bunch of like
Mm-hmm.
ragtag group of people. Um, and this is the big thing, and this is such a nitpick, but well, no, it's not because it's very contrived. One thing that bugs me about both the show and the game is that at the very end, when Ellie Ellie is about to be killed so they can replicate the virus.
Hmm.
Okay, I've been to the doctor before. I'm sure you have too. How long does it take to get like result of a blood test back?
Long time.
Like, or even if it was like a couple hours, like just a
Yeah.
blood test. You have the cure for humanity.
Hmm.
The seemingly only immune girl in history. She might be your only shot to save humanity.
Hmm.
And within like a couple hours, you're about to fucking put that bitch on the table and
Yeah.
cut her open. What are
Yeah.
you doing? You're not gonna
Yeah.
take x-rays. You're not gonna fucking, I don't
I
know,
know.
put her in isolation, take some blood, do some other tests. Like within like, because again, it's established that Joel gets knocked out and he wakes up.
Hmm.
So at most, like what has, if I'm charitable, like what, a day? There's
Well,
no fucking way. Come
well,
on.
another kind of contrivance where I was like, why didn't Marlene just kill Joel? And like, I mean, I get it, right? She's like in her mind kind of morally good, so she's trying not to kill people she doesn't have to. Joel saved Ellie, but if she's willing to kill the girl that she, supposedly, raised from a daughter or whatever, saved her life because of her friendship with her mother. If she's willing to kill that kid, and she's like, hey, I know what I'm doing is evil here because I raised that girl or whatever, but I'm still willing to do it for humanity. Why is she gonna let Joel live? To it just, and that seemed really incompetent. But again, it was like it was hard for me to grasp like what what is the capability of the Fireflies. How well stocked are they? How are they connected too? Because we go to different cities, right? And they talk about these groups kind of like as they're like chapters of a fraternity where they're all independent.
Hmm.
Like the Fedra in Kansas City is a bunch of like, they're more like mafia than other Fedra. And I was like, well, I don't quite get how this works. Like you're not developing this. Like who's running Fedra? Who's It would have been nice. I mean, again, it doesn't sound like it's in the game, but it would have been nice to be like, hey, can we get some characters on the Fedra side and see like, hey, how does this world work from a world building standpoint? It just was really hard for me to grasp that, and it kind of felt like, oh, okay, I guess I'm not supposed to really care about the Fedra Firefly conflict. It's just some background fluff you're just throwing at me occasionally.
Yeah, I think that was, I think it is done better in the game. But I think that definitely is sort of a flaw where, but again, I almost wonder if that was, people have argued, is it sort of on purpose? Like, are the Fireflies sort of purposely being portrayed as sort of like buffoons who kind of don't know what they're doing, and they're just kind of like running on empty and they stand no chance against Fedra? You'll you'll find people who agree and disagree and whatnot. Um, but yeah, so yeah, the ending, just to kind of bring it back, the ending is what I kind of like about the ending, and you kind of did mention where you said it wasn't surprising. Um, One thing I actually do appreciate how it works in the game, and to some extent the show. Again, it's hard for me to kind of separate my, because I knew exactly what was going to come. Um, one thing to one thing I think the game does well is that it doesn't really treat it as a twist, because it kind of happens very quickly. It's almost like almost to the point where like you don't even process what's happening. You're just kind of, because you play Joel in the scene where he's going after Ellie, and he kills like a lot of people in the game in that sequence. Um, and so you're one. I think having that agency over Joel does change it, because we're kind of, again, we're in his POV. We're like, no, not Ellie. We love her. We just want to save her, without really thinking about, oh wait, hang on, should we be doing this? Should we, do we want to do this? And then it's actually a brilliant moment in the game. So that moment where in the show when he shoots the doctor, in the game, so up until now, Joel is given the option whether or not to, because again, you're controlling Joel. So when you kill people, you're the one killing them. In that scene though, where he kills the doctor, the game makes you do it. You have to kill the doctor to, and what players have um sort of interpreted that as is that was the moment where the game was basically telling you, hey, you're not Joel. Like, Joel is a separate person. This is what he is doing. Whether or not you think that like he's doing the right thing or the wrong thing, or if this is what Ellie wants or what she doesn't want, this is what Joel is doing. This is what he would do. Um, and I think that's part of why the ending, it's there's a lot of subversion going on in the actual game. It's very subtle. Whereas the show, it kind of lacks it just because you're not in his perspective. But again, what kind of works well is it's same thing in the show. When it ends, you're almost like, wait, that's it? But then you start to think about, oh shit, did he do the right thing? Did he do it for the right reasons? Does Ellie believe him? Oh, I actually should ask you, because that's the biggest question at the end of the game. Um, in your interpretation, do you believe that Ellie, what do you think Ellie, when she asks Joel, tell me everything about the Fireflies is true? How do you read that scene?
I mean, I was like, I get why he did it. Like I said, it wasn't a shock to me at all. That's the point where I was like, it wasn't this like, oh my god, crazy moment. It's like, of course he's gonna kill those people, and save her. The fact that he lied about it, I was like, oh, okay. I mean, you should probably be truthful with her because that's what friends are supposed to do. Like, just tell her, like, hey, they were gonna cut your brain open, and I would have explained to her again, like, they don't know that they can make a cure from your brain. They were just gonna kill you, like, on the off chance that they could make a cure. And again, all the reasons you've explained why he does it. I also watched the little, like, after the episode segment where the guy explains what happens, the creator, and he explained, it's like, oh, it's such a subversive choice, like, or whatever, that it's like he's doing something that he knows she wouldn't want for her own benefit, but that it's a complicated issue. But again, I think because, like, you described it really well, the fact that you're not playing as Joel and you're just this very passive person watching these events happen, for me it just didn't have this real impact. Like there was that kind of cut at the end, right, where he's like, yes, it was true. Like, he lies to her and it just kind of cuts, and it's like, I feel like I was meant to be shocked and being like, oh my god, I don't know how to process what I'm feeling, and it's like, nah, not really. It just kind of was like, whatever. Time to watch Sopranos again. Like, it just, I wasn't invested into this that much. Again, maybe because I didn't play the game, maybe I'm not as close to these characters. But it just didn't have a, like I've seen way more like endings that emotionally resonated with me than this one did.
I definitely think the way the narrative is because a lot of people do argue that one a big flaw of The Last of Us the game is that it's a movie game. It's just like you
Yeah,
just walk. It's a walking simulator. I actually
I want
disagree
to
with
talk
that.
about that.
Yeah. I agree with that to some extent. The gameplay is rather underwhelming. However, I disagree in the sense that I actually think the gameplay segments are. So
Hmm.
to kind of bring it back to that, what I was talking about POV. So
Hmm.
in the first like 7 hours of the game, we're playing as Joel
Yeah.
and we're killing people and we're protecting Ellie. But then we get to the section where Joel is out of commission and we're playing as
Yeah.
Ellie. And then, so what the game is sort of communicating to us is that, like, what is Joel's purpose here? What is
Hmm.
he doing in the story? And it's like, oh well, he's Ellie's protector. That's why he's doing it. But then you're kind of like, well, hang on. She hasn't really. I mean, like, obviously she, he is bigger and stuff like that.
Hmm.
But like, she's able to handle herself. She can kill
Yeah.
people and like that. So what the game is sort of almost like subconsciously instilling in the player, and this kind of comes out later on, where Ellie has a purpose. Her purpose in the story is to arrive at the Fireflies to get
Yeah.
the cure. That is her purpose. That is what
Yeah.
she's fighting for. But what is Joel fighting for? And it's to bond with Ellie, to kind of like make that, to be her protector, to be her father, to sort of to to protect Ellie, as because he couldn't protect Sarah.
Hmm.
Um, but at the end, when he saves her, it's sort of this idea of Joel robbed Ellie of her purpose in
Hmm.
order to retain his own,
Yeah.
because he couldn't stand, and he didn't do it maliciously or in like a selfish
Yeah.
way, but there is this sort of vibe of like,
Yeah.
where, like, yes, like, we're glad that you're both alive and like you're with Ellie, that's great, but now where is she? Now
Hmm.
she what the whole time we're built up, Ellie is the person who will make the cure and save the world and
Yeah.
avenge, and this is the big thing, avenge the people she loves. Like,
Yeah.
that's like, make it all worth it, or as she
Hmm.
says, it can't be for nothing. And
Yeah.
Joel has sort of robbed that from her.
Yeah.
Even if there was a that's another sort of issue with the tale, where I think that both the game and the show want you to sort of, it's sort of insisting that, like, yes, a vaccine would have been made. And it's
Mm.
kind of insisting it upon you, which
Yeah.
I think is a bit of a flaw, because you
Yeah.
can just be like, well, what if it didn't work? Or what if
Yeah.
it, you know?
Yeah.
But I think the game is trying to instill in the player, it kind of wants you to, like, in terms of suspension of disbelief, oh no, we totally could have made a vaccine. Because if
Yeah.
not, like you said, even if it was only like a 50/50 chance, it does kind of make it like, well, I don't know if we want to kill her just for
Yeah.
a chance of making it. But yeah.
Yeah. And again, like I said, I think, or what you said, I think that whole explanation of how she's immune kind of, it makes it kind of wonky. Because I also am like, I don't understand why she put her in that camp. If this is what her plan was the whole time, right? To eventually harvest her brain or whatever, why wouldn't you just keep her with you the whole time? I don't
Well,
understand why they had to move her to Montana to do this,
so in
or
the
wherever they
show,
would end up.
Marlene doesn't know that Ellie is immune at the start. She only finds out later when Riley gets bitten, and then they find Ellie,
Oh,
and she's like, "Oh, you got bit, but you're fine."
did they
Um,
show that on the show? Because I don't remember that.
no, they don't.
Okay, that's again.
And
I
that's
mean,
why,
maybe it's that stuff like that why I didn't understand what was going on.
yeah, so that's why Ellie is tied up at the beginning of the first episode, because the Fireflies found her bitten, but she hasn't turned yet, and they're like, "Oh, wait, what the fuck?" So
Oh, I
they,
don't remember that at all.
oh yeah, so it's in the first episode.
No, I
So
mean
they
I
tie
remember
her.
her. I remember her tied up, but I don't. If there was an explanation of how she got from the scene with Riley to how she got there.
Oh no, I'm just like reasonably filling in the blanks. It's like they,
Oh, okay. Because I it
yeah,
didn't. I don't again. Maybe again because I wasn't. They never like said that kind of stuff to me, so I was like, well, I don't understand what the fuck is happening here.
yeah. So to put two and two together, Ellie was found by the Fireflies. They saw that, like, hey, you were bitten, but um you haven't turned yet. In the game, the I guess the implication is that after Ellie was bitten, she went to Marlene herself, because she thought, it's like, "Hey, I trust you. Look, what the fuck am I gonna do?" Yeah. So I think, again, I think that works better in the game. Um, but yeah, I really don't like how they kind of revealed why, or at least they implied why Ellie was immune, because that implies that, because in the game, because that kind of implies that, like, and maybe this is like my ignorance, but like, if there was like that, oh, it's because if a mother is pregnant and she gets bitten, but then the baby is born shortly after, the baby's immune. Could the scientists, like, not figure that out in like 20 years? I mean, like, that's got to work somehow, right? It gets passed on. Like, I assume scientists were like, hey, like, maybe heritability, like, so but in the game it's never explained, because it doesn't have to. It's supposed to be like this unfounded miracle that just is a 1 in a million, 1 in a bajillion, 1 in a 7 billion chance that one person is infected. And that's the entire point, because it adds weight to Joel's decision, where it's like, this was the only chance. Whereas it's like, in after they reveal it, it's like, well, maybe that'll happen again. I don't know, like, maybe. One thing I think it is kind of cool. There was So you remember at the beginning of the first episode when the little boy walks to the FEDRA checkpoint?
Kind of know what happened.
Uh, so there's a scene where a little boy. It's the first scene we see after the flashback, after the jump forward 20 years. A little boy walks to the FEDRA outpost, and there's the nice FEDRA guard, and she's like, "Hey, how are you doing, honey?" And
Hmm.
they test the boy, and he's positive for the virus.
Yeah.
and then they euthanize him. I don't know if you remember that part.
Yeah, I remember that.
Because
Yeah, now.
then the next part we see Joel like throwing him into the fire.
Mm,
People have actually wondered if maybe the kid was immune as well,
mm,
which would have been kind of cool. However,
yeah,
that does lead the option. It's like, well, if Ellie isn't the only immune person,
yeah,
it kind of does defeat the purpose. Where it's like that, because that was kind of important. She is like
yeah,
the person, and that's what
yeah,
makes Joel's choice so. Because like, oh, we found someone else, Ellie. It's fine.
yeah.
It's like, well,
Exactly. I wanted to talk a little bit about. I know we're running out of time here, but you talked before about criticisms The Last of Us, the game, has gotten for basically being like a movie that you play. Now it's an interesting discussion because I am into a lot of like RPG kind of games. I've been playing Fallout New Vegas on stream on my channel recently. And that's the type of game where you have complete freedom, right? That's what the game's all about. You get to choose what you want to do. And funny enough, there's a sequence kind of like the thing with Ellie at the end where it's like there's a character who's going to sacrifice themselves in one of the DLCs, but you've kind of become friends with this character and you can choose to save them, but to save them, you have to choose to do this horrible thing that's going to destroy the lives of millions of people. Um, and it's up to you what you decide to do. You can let the character sacrifice himself, or you can do the horrible thing but save your friend. And that was a powerful thing for me when I played it because again, it's my choice. It's based on my values as the player character that I'm completely crafting, and that runs antithetical to something like The Last of Us or a lot of Naughty Dog games where it's like, no, you're playing our pre-scripted character who has their own values, and you're controlling them for certain segments, but you're on rails for the story that we are crafting. Now I think both of those can be interesting stories, interesting ways to play a game. Like you said, The Last of Us has this element, it seems like, of immersion where it's like it's making you feel closer to Joel than you would from just watching him on screen. And again, I can confirm as someone who has just watched it, I don't feel as connected to Joel as you seem to be from someone who played the game.
mm-hmm.
Both I think are very valid, but they're just different ways of telling a story.
Yeah. Funny enough, this is gonna seem unrelated, but I promise it is. I remember Paul Thomas Anderson, the film director. Because he was asked by someone about the difference between film and digital, because that's kind of like a big thing when it comes to film. Like directors, like, oh, we're shooting on digital, like selling out and shit like that. And I think Paul's, and like, there are people who have strong opinions. Tarantino is obviously like, fuck digital, like only film. Um, but I think Paul Thomas Anderson's view is perfect. And he said, I think that both film and digital are great. They both have their own strengths. They both are filmmaking tools and you can use them as you please. However, when one tries to be the other, when you try to start to like make one act like the other one, that's when you're like, it's like they're just two separate things and neither one is better than the other. To your point, I think that is exactly how I feel about, because people, that's always the question. It's like, is it better to have games that are like really like experiences where they're like very curtailed, or like open world exploration? And the answer is like, well, it depends. There are plenty of open world games that fucking blow because they're just like, oh, there's full of stuff for you to do, but they're boring. They're just like, it's a bunch of just like fetch quests, and it's almost like it's almost too it's almost too expansive. There's almost too much to do where it's like, and like something with Fallout New Vegas, as you mentioned, one reason why that game works is because it's so well designed that you feel the effects of one action spread across the entire desert. Whereas in other open world games, it doesn't feel that way. It just makes it feel like your actions don't have effects on the world around you. So at that point, it's like, why even have the open world? Um, but then on the flip, but then on the flip side, you have something like The Last of Us. Now, The Last of Us is a perfect example of how you can still have a game that is kind of a quote unquote movie game. It's a very curtailed experience, but it can still enhance the narrative. Because again, oh man, all these like walking scenes where you with Joel and Ellie, you kind of don't realize until the end that, oh, actually, hang on, I was building a relationship there. I didn't realize it, but those like boring walking scenes actually do have an effect. But then there are other games, one, especially after The Last of Us came out and it got so much acclaim, where they're literally just movies. They're just like all the walking scenes are just like exposition jumps. They have no effect on the actual story or the narrative or the thematic weight of the game, and that shit drives. I would rather play a boring open world game than like one of these like AAA walking simulators that don't understand the purpose of what a walking simulator is supposed to do.
And you know, there's other kinds of walking simulators too. There was a big thing in the indie scene a long time ago, which was walking sims where you're walking through a house and there's like a narrator who talks to you and you don't really do anything, and that's a really shitty way to do that too, because it's just like you're not getting the kind of character building by actually living in the world. You're just kind of being told what the story is while you walk around, which is very boring.
Well, I mean, like, I would argue it depends on the game because I've played games like that that are incredible, and the reason, like, there's a great one, probably the first game that I ever played. Have you ever played a game? It's called Gone Home.
Well, that was going to be one of the that was what I was describing.
Oh yeah, so I would argue that Gone Home, the reason it works is yes, you are being told the story, but the reason it works is because as you're playing the game, it juxtaposes with it's almost like you almost feel it's like framed as like a horror game of like, oh, it's like, oh, around every corner. But then you play the game, there's nothing there. But at least for me, and this might just be a personal thing, at least for me, the reason it works is because it kind of instilled in me the uneasy feeling of this girl who has returned to her home and doesn't know where she is. It's almost like, and again, it's not like a traditional narrative. Another perfect example, one of my favorite games is uh, the Pains the Pains Creek Killings. You play a reporter who goes to this empty town, and you're trying to solve a murder, but it's like 20 years after the murder, so all you have is diary entries and letters, and the entire town is empty. There's no one else in the town. You don't even interact with other characters, but it's designed in a way where that isolation, you're supposed to feel like you're in an area that's been forgotten. Very similar to like Shadow of the Colossus. It's like that. It's like, oh, all you do is just ride across this open landscape. It's like, yes, but that's the point. It's supposed to instill something on you. But the difference is that in Shadow of the Colossus, the programmers knew what they were doing. It was done very purposefully. It might not be your cup of tea, but it gives you the effect that it's supposed to. But then I see games that just they don't understand how to make a game like that work, and and it's just boring as fuck. It's like, yeah, I should have just read the Wikipedia entry on this because it's not the same thing.
I think that, again, another example we talked about before of like open world games that or games that combine open world with curated experiences tend to be very bad. I kind of think of like the comparison to Skyrim, which is Skyrim is supposedly this very big open world, but like all the experiences you do in it tend to be very curated, where it's like, nope, there's only one way to progress this quest. So because we want you to see the fun little sequence we designed over here, and there's no way you can get around it. And once you're done, you exit off the roller coaster. And that's a game there. It's like, I mean, a lot of people like Skyrim, but it gets very boring after a while, compared to something like New Vegas, which I'm absolutely loving. Because again, there are many ways to tackle all the issues, and your choices really matter. But like you said, it comes down to what the developers are trying to do. It's the same. I think the same thing with film too. It's like there's a lot of different ways to make a movie, and there's people who break the rules, but they do it in like a deliberate manner that's contributing to the tone they're going for, the theme they're going for, whatever. And it's just a lot of it's going to come down to personal preference. It's not everyone's going to love every single movie, not everyone's going to love every single gameplay experience. but it ultimately it's what your intention is with the medium.
A perfect example, just to kind of compare it, is found footage horror movies. Um, Something like the Blair Witch Project. A lot of people didn't. The reason the Blair Witch Project is so good is because the style it was made in was purposeful. Obviously, like the filmmakers, like it was like, they didn't have a lot of money, but the entire point of the movie is that you're supposed to feel like it's supposed to feel like it's just a random kid is filming all this shit going on. It's supposed to be very scary and disorienting. Whereas in more, and like not all of them, but in a lot of found footage horror movies, you can tell that it's just like there's no reason this movie is a found footage horror movie. You just didn't have money to like make it like a not a found footage horror movie.
Or you're like the Blair Witch Project was really successful, so we're just copying that, you know.
Yeah, and there are some where I actually you have to ask, or someone actually mentioned the Blair Witch Project, you should watch it on like the shittiest VCR player you can find. And it's like, but that's saying something where it's like, oh, like the production quality isn't good and it's not presented. It's like, but that's okay. It's supposed to be like that. Um, the same way that like I've played video games like that too, where like the graphics aren't as good, maybe on an older game, but like it's the reason it works is because it kind of is supposed to feel like that. You're supposed to feel not if it's too polished, it almost is like it almost ruins the experience. It's supposed to kind of be a little janky, a little rough around the
Yeah,
edges.
I think a lot of remasters tend to kind of ruin that too because
I
again,
agree.
the aesthetic really works for the time period, and I love retro games. One, because they're a lot easier to run on computers, so you don't have to like have
Yes.
the nicest PC setup in the world, and their file sizes are so fucking small. It's great. I love playing old games, but anyway, we're past our time here. I hope you all have enjoyed our discussion again. I'm coming in completely fresh. So if there's anything I said where you're like, you're a fucking pleb, how do you not know, who the president of FEDRA was? It's like, well, I was watching. I only watched the show. Okay, but I hope you found our discussion to be interesting, and yeah, stay tuned for the next time where we'll have another topic to discuss.
Take care, y'all. Have a good night.